The bone folder felt like a familiar extension of my hand, its polished surface gliding over the worn calfskin spine of a book that had seen 2 centuries pass. The air in my workshop, a complex blend of aging paper, leather, and faint traces of Earl Grey tea, was my sanctuary. It was in this sacred silence, as I was about to press a delicate line into the leather, that my granddaughter Lyra's voice cut through the stillness. It wasn't a whisper, it was a shard of ice. "They're not just taking the store, Grandma. They're trying to erase you." The tool in my hand stopped, a millimeter from the gilded lettering. My breath caught, not from the near ruin of my work, but from the chilling finality in her tone. It held no tremor of adolescent drama. It was a diagnosis, delivered with cold precision. In that moment, the quiet hum of the dehumidifier, the distant chime of the bell above the bookstore's main entrance, everything faded into a muted roar. That day, the bookstore, Vance Sons, a name that had stood for a century on the cobblestone streets of Providence, did not smell of history. It smelled of ozone and industrial cleaner. My daughter, Serafina, had commissioned a brand refresh. Towering, minimalist floral arrangements stood like sentinels where comforting armchairs used to be. The warm, amber glow of the old lamps had been replaced by harsh LED tracks that stripped the room of its soul. Her partner, Gavin, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, was overseeing the installation of a brushed steel coffee bar, his gaze calculating the value of the space, not the history within its walls. Serafina stood near the front window in a cream-colored cashmere suit, a portrait of effortless control. She was preparing for a launch party, an event designed to celebrate the store's transition into the digital age. My transition, my erasure. And then there was me, Ilara Vance. I stood in the doorway of my workshop, the ancient book cradled in my hands, a relic in my own museum. My spine felt the immense weight of every story I had ever preserved. Lyra moved to my side, her presence a silent affirmation. This wasn't a simple business disagreement. This was a quiet, meticulously planned coup. I forced a smile and walked into the main room, placing the restored volume onto a stand. It was a first edition of Moby Dick which Serafina had claimed to love as a child. It struck me then that I was the one preserving the very things she was so eager to discard. The guests, a collection of tech investors and influencers, began to arrive. Someone from a digital media company started a live stream. Gavin wrapped an arm around Serafina's waist, the two of them posing like the unveiling of a new piece of hardware. Lyra's eyes never left mine. She knew this party wasn't for me. It was for the ghost they were creating in my place. Let's be clear. This is not a story where the dam breaks in a single flood. It is the story of 1,000 silent cracks, of a slow erosion that happens while you are busy loving someone until you find there is no room left for you. After the last of the champagne flutes were cleared, Lyra found me in the darkened biography section. She held a small leather-bound journal. Her face was grim, her youthful energy replaced by a solemnity that made her seem years older. Gavin was in the newly designated media lounge, his laughter a booming, artificial sound. Serafina was on a conference call in her new glass-walled office, her voice a sharp staccato. Every corner of this building, every memory soaked into the floorboards, was being repurposed as a backdrop for their narrative of progress. Lyra opened the journal. It wasn't a recording she played. It was a transcript she had painstakingly written down from a conversation she'd overheard. Gavin's voice, as she'd transcribed it. "The narrative has to be perfect. She's not being pushed out. She's retiring gracefully. We emphasize her age, her attachment to the past. We frame this as an act of love." Then Serafina's words, colder. "Dr. Albright is on board. He'll conduct the cognitive assessment next week. He agrees that her resistance to the digital upgrades can be presented as symptomatic of cognitive decline. Once we have his report, the petition for conservatorship is a formality. The board will see it as a responsible measure to protect the family's primary asset. I didn't breathe. An asset. I stared at a shelf of presidential biographies, their stoic faces seeming to mock me. I reached out and straightened a slightly crooked volume. "They need me declared incompetent," I said, the words tasting like ash. "They need your story," Lyra corrected, her voice low but fierce. "But they need to be the ones to tell it." I stood there and thought of all the years I had yielded for Serafina. When her first business venture failed, I had absorbed the debt without a word, refinancing the building to give her a soft place to land. And slowly, methodically, she had made the space hers. The minimalist art, the ergonomic chairs, the endless tangle of charging cables. I hadn't chosen any of it. I had simply allowed it, because that is the boundless, foolish generosity of a mother's love. You cede territory, inch by inch, until you find yourself a stranger in your own homeland. Lyra reached into her satchel and pulled out a slim file. There's more. Printed emails discussed the liquidation of the rare book collection. Insurance documents for the building listed Gavin as a co-beneficiary, and a schedule for an in-home evaluation with a Dr. Albright, a man who would determine the fate of my mind. They weren't just taking over the business. They were planning to seize my life. I didn't speak. I walked to my old oak desk, my father's desk, and looked out at the small courtyard garden. The wisteria vine was overgrown, choking the life out of the roses. Something else had taken root. That night, I didn't go up to my apartment. I sat in the dark, in my father's worn leather chair, long after the LED lights had been turned off. I stayed there, surrounded by the silent, watchful company of a million stories, listening to the walls of my own life close in. The bookstore was dead quiet, the silence of a tomb. I remembered Serafina, age 7, sitting on the workshop floor, mesmerized as I stitched signatures into a new binding. She would ask why old books smelled like vanilla. I let her believe I held all the secrets of the world. Tonight, I sat behind the grand mahogany counter, thinking of how Serafina had introduced me at the party. Not as her mother, but as the curator of our foundational narrative. I was an artifact, a piece of the origin story she was preparing to sell. I pulled open a drawer beneath the counter, one where I'd always kept personal things. Most were gone, likely discarded during a streamlining, but one remained, a piece of construction paper folded into a card. Inside, in a child's script, it read, "For Mom, you are the best storyteller in the world." I placed it back carefully. The silence no longer felt like peace. It felt like an accusation. When Lyra came down the next morning, she found me at the counter, the card lying before me. I hadn't slept. Sleep felt like a surrender. Sleep meant waking up in a world where my own daughter was scripting my final chapter, casting me as the tragic eccentric who needed to be saved from herself. The file Lyra had given me wasn't thick, but its contents felt heavier than any folio in my collection. These were not plans. They were meticulously executed arrangements. 3 documents were the linchpins. The first was a series of digital signature authorizations, granting Serafina administrative access to the bookstore's online accounts and my personal banking portal. The signature looked like mine, but it was too perfect. The second was a draft of a press release announcing my voluntary retirement and the transfer of my shares to an LLC in Serafina's and Gavin's names. The third was Dr. Albright's preliminary cognitive health profile, based entirely on information provided by Serafina. It painted a picture of a confused woman with obsessive-compulsive behaviors, unable to adapt. It was a character assassination disguised as a medical document. I sat there for a long time. Lyra made a pot of tea, the familiar ritual a small anchor. The store felt alien. I walked to a tall, locked cabinet in the corner of my workshop. It was where I kept the true treasures, the original deed to the building, my father's journals, and priceless first editions. I had installed the lock myself years ago. It had 2 keys, One was on the ring in my pocket. The other I had given to Serafina as a teenager, for emergencies only. I checked my keychain. My key was there. That evening, after Serafina returned from a meeting, she breezed through the store, mentioning offhandedly that the security system needed a smarter upgrade. I waited until the building was quiet again, until her footsteps faded above. I went to the cabinet. It was unlocked. The lock wasn't broken. It had been opened with a key. She had used hers. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat in my father's chair, the file in my lap. Around 3 a.m, I went into the workshop and found a box of my old bookbinding tools, awls with worn wooden handles, knives with softened blades. I laid them carefully on my workbench. Then I went back to the cabinet, locked it, and pocketed the key. I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. This was about the sanctity of a life's work, about the silent, creeping theft of one's own story. It was about erasure, one document, one password, one key at a time. On Wednesday morning, Serafina announced they would be filming a spontaneous segment for her web series, Legacy Reimagined. Her followers, she claimed, adored authenticity. Gavin arrived, his camera equipment in sleek cases. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that felt as cold as glass and told me I looked timeless. My workshop had been commandeered. Serafina replaced my antique marbled papers with a white idea board. Gavin fussed with lighting rigs. He asked me to sit at a sterile desk they had brought in. I remained at my old, scarred workbench. Lyra stood by my side. As I prepared to demonstrate a gold leafing technique, she slipped a small black audio recorder from her pocket and placed it discreetly between a pot of glue and a stack of paper. She placed a heavy book press in front of it and stepped back. Serafina took her position, smiling for the camera. She introduced me as if I were a charming artisan she had discovered. Her hand rested on my shoulder, a gesture not of affection, but of possession. We began the demonstration. I spoke about the art of gilding. Serafina called it a beautiful metaphor for honoring our past while creating a brilliant future. When the filming stopped, the atmosphere curdled. Serafina took a bottle of mineral water from Gavin. "A little dry," she replied to his unspoken question, not looking at me. "She's not giving us enough emotion." Then she turned to me, her smile a polished mask. "Maybe we can try another take later, Mom. Something with a little more heart. Perhaps wear a softer color?" My eyes met Lyra's. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That evening in my apartment, Lyra played the recording. It had captured everything: the condescending tone, the manufactured script, and the conversation after. "She's the perfect brand anchor," Gavin's voice said. "The nostalgic element gives us credibility. We just need to manage the asset properly." Asset, not mother. I was the raw material for their product. I didn't cry. I felt a profound, hollowing cold. I asked her to play it again. That Friday, Lyra skipped her classes. She sat at the oak table in the back office, her laptop open. She'd been researching probate law. She tapped the screen, showing me a profile. "Arthur Abernathy," she said. "A friend of yours years ago. He retired, but he specializes in this. Undue influence, contested conservatorships." She had already found his number. I stood in the doorway, watching her navigate this darkness with a courage I had almost forgotten. She looked up, her eyes clear. "There's a clinical pattern to this, Grandma. It's called asset capture. They isolate, create dependency, and then rewrite reality." The words were brutal, but true. I walked to the kitchenette. In a cabinet behind Serafina's relabeled teas was a small tin box with my old handwritten inventory cards. I pulled one out for a first edition of A Room of One's Own and placed it on the counter. Serafina came in around noon. Her gaze fell on the inventory card. "That's an obsolete system, Mom," she said, her voice gentle, patronizing. "It doesn't integrate with the new software." Then she went into her glass office. I stared at the card. Then I slipped it into my apron pocket. That afternoon, Lyra called Arthur Abernathy. I sat beside her as she laid out the facts, concisely and without emotion. We were building a case. Quietly, meticulously. Before bed, I wrote a list. Not of grievances, but of books. The ones Serafina had deemed non-commercially viable. The ones that told the true story of this place. Sometimes, the most powerful rebellion isn't to fight. It is to let them build their pyre and then, calmly, rewrite the ending. On Sunday morning, I uncovered the old cast-iron book press that belonged to my grandfather. Serafina had wanted to sell it for scrap. I spent 2 hours cleaning and oiling its gears until they moved with a satisfying groan. Serafina and Gavin were at a tech conference. I had time. Lyra looked up from her work as I rolled the ancient press into the center of the main floor. She understood. That evening, I posted a notice on the bookstore's original, long-dormant social media page. A simple photo of the old book press and a handwritten invitation. An evening with the archivist, a live demonstration on the binding of a lost story. Tuesday evening. No hashtags, no branding. By the next morning, the post had been shared hundreds of times. Comments flooded in from old customers, local historians, former employees. Some said they missed the smell of old paper. Others simply said they missed me. Tuesday arrived. I wore my old linen work apron. Lyra, with a friend's help, set up a single camera and a microphone. Serafina and Gavin returned that afternoon. They saw the setup but said nothing. Serafina glanced at the book press and made a note on her phone, a slight smile on her lips. She assumed she could co-opt the event, turning my nostalgia into more content. At 6, I handed Lyra a sealed manila envelope. "This goes to Mr. Abernathy's courier in the morning," I said. It was my notarized affidavit and the audio file. She nodded. At 6:30, Serafina came downstairs in a sharp ivory pantsuit, her makeup flawless. At 7 o'clock, I stepped into the warm glow of a single spotlight. Just me, the press, and a story waiting to be bound. I began not with a book, but with a memory. I spoke of paper and ink, of how a legacy is a living story. 10 minutes in, Serafina entered the frame. She smiled for the camera and began to speak. I let her. Then I paused, looked into the lens and said, "But every story has a final chapter, and every book, a binding, the one thing that holds it all together. It's not thread or glue, it's truth." I lifted a second manila envelope from my workbench and placed it on the press. Then I turned off the spotlight, plunging the room into shadow. Behind the camera, Lyra hit save, then upload. That night, something fundamental was rebound. Not paper, me. The story was no longer theirs to tell. It was mine. The live stream had no flashy graphics, just the quiet image of my hands on a stack of unbound pages. I spoke slowly about the physical nature of memory, how a story becomes real only when it can be held. I told the history of the book I was binding, a collection of lost letters from the city's founder. Halfway through, Serafina stepped into the light. She smiled and placed a hand on my shoulder. "I'm so thrilled my mother decided to share this incredible process with all of you," she said, her voice bright. I nodded, said nothing. Gavin adjusted his lens to capture the tender mother-daughter tableau. Once the final signature was stitched, I placed the book block into the press. Then I reached below the workbench and lifted the manila folder. "I want to share one final component of this story," I said, my voice unwavering. "Not for the book, for the record." I opened the folder. Inside was not a lost letter, but a printed transcript. The conversation between Serafina and Gavin, the text of the press release announcing my retirement, the defamatory profile. I didn't accuse. I simply began to read, my voice calm and clear. "This is what it sounds like," I said, reading a line from their conversation. "When a legacy is rebranded as an asset, This is the sound of a story being erased. I closed the folder, slid it to the edge of the bench, and looked directly into the camera. The silence that followed was absolute. Serafina stood frozen. Gavin slowly lowered his phone. Lyra ended the stream with a quiet click. "Uploading now," she confirmed. I turned and gave the wheel of the book press one final, firm turn. The binding would hold. It didn't matter who stayed in the room. The truth had already left. The morning after was unnaturally still. Lyra was at her laptop, which was a waterfall of notifications. Messages poured in. "We hear you. We see you. Thank you." I simply read, letting their collective voice fill the spaces where mine had been silenced. Serafina and Gavin didn't emerge until after 9. She moved like a phantom. He paced the floor, muttering about slander and brand damage. By noon, the consequences began. The tech firm co-sponsoring the relaunch announced a partnership review. The online magazine that had featured Serafina removed the article. By late afternoon, Gavin was gone. He packed quickly and left without a word to Serafina. She spent the rest of the day in her glass office. That evening, I made dinner for Lyra and myself. As I washed the dishes, I saw Serafina in the hallway watching us. She looked diminished, the armor of her ambition stripped away. Her mouth opened, but no words came. She gave a single, small nod. Not an apology, just a quiet, defeated acknowledgement. Then she turned and walked away. I did not follow her. By the end of the week, the brand Serafina had built had evaporated. An official inquiry was opened by Adult Protective Services, citing potential financial exploitation. Serafina never cried. She moved through the bookstore with the detached air of a ghost. On Sunday, I went back into my workshop alone. Serafina's white idea board still hung on one wall. I turned it over. On the clean black slate, I wrote in white chalk, "A legacy is not a performance." I went to the locked cabinet and pulled out the original articles of incorporation for the store. On Monday morning, Lyra and I took them to the city courthouse. The records were restored. My name, Elara Vance, proprietor, was returned to its rightful place. There was no announcement, just a quiet correction in a dusty ledger. That night, I stood in my workshop again. The old book press stood ready. Serafina's apartment above the store was dark. Some empires crumble with a roar. Others collapse in silence. In the space that remains, you find not victory, but peace. Something earned not by fighting, but by standing still long enough to be seen. 2 weeks later, I reopened the workshop. No flyers, just an open door and the smell of old books. A new hand-carved sign read, "The Unbound Story." It wasn't a store anymore. It was a place for people to bring their own broken things, faded photographs, letters, books with broken spines, and learn how to mend them, to reclaim their own histories. Lyra helped run the workshops. Word spread the old way, from one person to another. Women my age came, their hands remembering crafts they'd been told were no longer useful. They brought their stories. One woman brought her mother's recipe book, its pages falling apart. As we stitched it back together, she spoke of her daughter, who saw the book as clutter. We didn't offer advice. We just listened. We worked. There were no cameras, no followers. There was only the quiet, sacred work of preservation. In the quiet, I understood that I had spent so long trying to be essential, trying to prove my worth. That weight was gone. Serafina never came back. I heard she had moved out west. That was her story to write now. The fragile thing she had built had shattered because there had been nothing inside to hold it together. But here, in this room filled with paper and thread, there was substance, there was weight. Lyra kept a journal, writing down the stories people brought in. She said maybe one day it would be a book. I told her it already was. Some stories don't need an audience. They just need to be saved. And sometimes that is more than enough.